and welcome everyone to the annual lecture of the Center for Business and Development Studies, CBDS, here at Copenhagen Business School. I'm Stefano Ponte, the director of CBDS, and I will be your virtual host today. CBDS is a research center dedicated to topics related to business and development studies. We carry out critical, engaged, and theoretically driven research on the roles of business, government, and civil society in promoting inclusive, just, and sustainable development. We focus on power dynamics, inequalities, and marginalized actors in the global south. Please check out our website, cbds.center, spelled like in American English, CENTER, to know more about our research, teaching, events, media presence, blog, and working paper series. I'm going to go through some technical details about how our annual lecture is going to be carried out today. We will be keeping all microphones muted and videos paused, except for the panelists when they speak. For questions and comments, there is a chat function that is operational. It will be open throughout, and I will be collecting those questions, and I will be asking those questions or providing those comments to the presenters in groups of 2, 3 in each round. We're going to go through each of our panelists one at a time, 20 minutes for presentation, 20 minutes for discussion for each of the 3 main events today. So if you have questions or comments as the speakers are presenting, please do write on the chat so that I can collect them ahead of time of the presentation. So the program, as you can see, hopefully on the screen, we have 3 main presentations today. The first one is by Andrew Crane, University of Bath, entitled Business, Modern Slavery and Freedom. This will be followed by Dinah Rajak, University of Sussex, Empowering the Third Billion, Global Markets, Local Enterprise and the Promise of Inclusion. And the third one will be by our own Michael Vendelbo Hansen and Peter Lund Thompson, both of CBDS, who are going to provide us some reflections on an edited book that they just published recently called Business and Development Studies, Issues and Perspectives. I will introduce each speaker individually at the start of the session. So for the time being now, I'm going to exit this slide and I will pull up. Okay, so Andrew, if you could speak so that your image comes up. Perfect. So Andrew Crane is professor in management, marketing, business, and society at the Center of Business, Organizations, and Society, CBOS, at the University of Bath. He also has good connections with CBS Sustainability, so he is known in our department, in the Department of Management, Society, and Communication. Andrew Crane, as research explores new ways of thinking about the social, ethical, and environmental dimensions of business. He is particularly known for work on the changing role of the corporation in the global economy, where he's been influential in developing a new view of corporate citizenship that addresses the political roles and responsibilities of business. He is also focused on how ideas of ethics, freedom, and responsibility are communicated and managed by corporations, consumers, and other stakeholders. Finally, his work has also addressed specific application areas of corporate responsibilities, in particular forced labor and slavery. We're going to talk about that today, as well as competitive intelligence, responsible marketing, non-profit partnerships, and responsibilities for children. Of the many articles and books that Andrew Crane has published, I would like to highlight for today the book Business Ethics that he did with Dirk Mattern, Sarah Gloser, and Laura Spence, which is now in its 5th edition. Andrew, the word to you. If you could then share your your desktop, and the floor is yours. You have 20 minutes for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much for the introduction, Stefano. Hopefully everyone can see my slide there. And I have to say, thank you for the invitation to speak at your annual lecture this year. I was obviously supposed to be there in Copenhagen with you giving this talk. And so, it's a shame I can't, but at the same time, I think also by moving it online now, we have the opportunity to speak to a broader, much more global audience. And so I look forward to the different kind of conversations that arise out of this. And when I was talking to Stefano before, we were planning on what I was going to talk about. They were very keen for me to talk about modern slavery. And I thought what I would do is give a very brief overview of my work in this area on business and modern slavery, and give a little flavour of some of the projects I've been working on, in particular one project which I'll spend a little bit more time on, which is looking at some of the notions of freedom which are embedded in this question of business and modern slavery. So, without further ado, I will take us forward. So what are we talking about here with modern slavery? Now, there are lots and lots of definitions out there. Many people use it in a fairly indiscriminate way, sometimes not well defined, sometimes in the same way as other labels such as forced labour and other sorts of things. But essentially what we're talking about when we talk about modern slavery as opposed to more ancient or traditional forms of slavery is we've shifted from the actual legal ownership of people to something that's like that but slightly different. And so using this League of Nations definition, which has tended to be very highly influential in international law, it talks about not actual ownership, but the exercise of any or all of the powers attaching to the right of ownership. So if you can act towards someone as if you own them, so it's like you own them, then we can start talking about that as being like a slavery relationship. And so trying to put some kind of flesh on the bones of that, the kind of Harvard-Bellagio guidelines on the legal parameters of slavery, try and kind of make a bit more sense of this. So when we're talking about these kind of the right of ownership, what those powers look like, what we're talking about here is some kind of control over a person, right? That's the defining characteristic, which would deprive them of their liberty with the intent of exploitation, and then importantly, usually through means such as violent force, deception, coercion. And we see many kind of examples of these forms of modern slavery happening in the global economy. You might see news about people perhaps growing cocoa in West Africa, or perhaps fishing for seafood in Southeast Asia. We see lots and lots of examples coming through in the media. And where is this happening? How many people is it happening to? Well, as many as you know, you may well know, the kind of statistics on this are always difficult to get, right? This is something that is very much now a kind of hidden crime. It's very hard to uncover exactly how many people are in these situations. It's not like we have formal ownership documents like the slavery of the past, but we also know it's happening to millions of people. And this is from the Global Slavery Index, which gives a sense of the prevalence. So that the deeper the red here, the higher the prevalence. So that means the kind of density, if you like, of slavery as a proportion of the population. And you can see this is kind of particularly evident in parts of Africa, the Middle East, and West Asia. Then we could look at perhaps how many the countries that have the highest number, absolute number of people in these situations. And these would be countries such as India, China, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc. And then we can think about what the numbers are in total. And as I say, it's very hard to get a firm grip on this. We know it's in the order of millions. The most current estimate from the Global Slavery Index would suggest it's something like 40 million people. And it may be very different to that, but it's of that kind of order of magnitude that we're talking about. And although this may give a sense that this is purely a kind of developing world problem, clearly these incidents of slavery have been identified in pretty much every country in the world. It happens here in the UK, where I am now. It happens in Denmark, in the US, wherever you are, there have been incidents of modern slavery. It also affects us not just in terms of people being in these situations of exploitation in our countries, but also the goods that we import perhaps being tainted by modern slavery. And again, this is from the Global Slavery Index, which gives a sense of those countries which are importing the largest amounts of products which are at risk of modern slavery. And you'll see in the middle here the types of products that are most at risk are things such as laptops, computers, kind of technology products, clothes and garments, and then different food products such as fish, cocoa and sugarcane. And the countries which are importing large numbers of these products are countries like the United States, Japan, Germany, United Kingdom, France, etc. So, major importing countries. So this is a problem that affects all of us. It affects every country. And if any of you have a laptop or a mobile phone or wear clothes or eat food, then it's likely that at some point you have had something of your products will have been tainted by modern slavery in some way. And in recent times, during COVID, this whole issue has again kind of been in the spotlight, both in terms of the kind of worsening conditions for workers in global supply chains and the greater propensity of there being modern slavery as a result of that. And we've seen this particularly in products which are in high demand. So suddenly there's a huge demand for products such as personal protective equipment for medical workers. And there's been numerous incidents of, this is a UK case, but of health systems, health procurement, buying in PPE made potentially in slavery-like conditions in Asia and other places. So we know it's a problem. We know it kind of gets worse in particular contexts as well. And so the question then comes, this is somebody in a business school, interested in business, interested in the management of this issue. So what has our research been telling us about this? And a recent paper that myself and some colleagues published in the Journal of Business and Society as a result of a special issue that we did, we came up with this conclusion. This is the title of the paper, but I think it says enough that you need to know about it. Modern slavery in business, the sad and sorry state of a non-field. Our review of the literature was that there's very little has been said yet in the business and management field about this problem of modern slavery. So we know it affects millions of people. We know it affects every country across the globe. But for some reason, there's been very little research in my discipline about this. And in this paper, we sought to explore why, but also to explore what was happening in neighbouring disciplines. And we looked at political science and law, for example, but also in development studies, there has been a growing attention to this issue. And gradually that's filtering through into business and management studies. What I want to do today is give you a little overview of some of the work that we've been doing to try and rectify this kind of lack of attention in business and management and show perhaps a little bit of why we think that business and management has should have an important voice in this conversation. And this is work I've been doing with a wide range of co-authors, so it's not just my work at all. You can see some of them in the slide here, but many other people as well who've been involved with me on these projects. And this is essentially what the project looks like. So trying to look at modern slavery in relation to these different facets of business. So on the left here, it tends to be a starting point for all of this, thinking about the regulation and governance of modern slavery, and then how that transpires in relation to the supply chains of modern slavery, in the actual strategies and management of companies and how that feeds into modern slavery, in the consumption practices, and then also on how firms are reporting on this as it becomes increasingly required of them to do so in various countries. So I'm just going to give two flavour from two parts of this: the supply chains part and the strategies and management part, both of which feed into this question about the regulation and governance of modern slavery. So on the supply chains dimension of this, there's lots of supply chain dynamics that feed into our understanding of how the business of modern slavery works. And the essential kind of conclusion, if you like, to our research in this space is that current supply chain organisation both enables and perpetuates modern slavery. And one of the projects, or one of the earlier projects that we did in this space, we looked at industries such as food and construction in the UK, so where forced labour had been identified in the UK, and trying to identify when that happens in the UK, what were the supply chain dynamics like? And we tried to map the supply chains that gave rise to those incidents of forced labour. And we kind of interviewed various people around the topic, around this. And we came up with these sorts of pictures. So this would be a food supply chain. So thinking about something such as some leeks or potatoes that may be grown in a farm in the UK and end up in a retailer in the UK, like Tesco's or Sainsbury's or somebody like that. And so across the top here, in the horizontal product supply chain, we might have a fairly simple supply chain. The retailer there at P4, which will be Tesco, say, is being perhaps sourcing from a processor, but perhaps not, perhaps even going straight from a farmer. So not a complicated supply chain. And the forced labour, the modern slavery is happening at that P2 in the farm. So very close to where the retailer is, very close to the consumer. We know exactly the farms where these things happen. So why doesn't this get spotted more often? Why is this a problem to identify and deal with? And what we identify as the main challenge here is what we call the labour supply chain. So not the product supply chain, but how workers come to be employed in that farm. And the problem comes from high degrees of outsourcing in the labour supply. So the farmer may have some workers, but they will outsource to agencies, which is L1 here, but that agency may well outsource to other agencies because they don't have enough workers, and they outsource again. And then it starts to become informal, which is where the grey areas come. It might be someone that's not really an official agent, but knows some other workers that they can get to help in this harvest. And then at some point, that may feed into a forced labour situation, the kind of black boxes there. So it's about these kind of high degrees of intermediation in the labour supply chain that are the cause of these problems. And here's another one from the construction industry, slightly different here. Across the bottom, you'll see the product supply chain. P2 is the kind of construction site, the builder, the main company that's responsible for building a house or a block of flats or something. And again, fairly simple product supply chain. But what happens is that builder subcontracts to all these other P2s, right? The subcontracting of building to other building companies, different parts of the construction work, all happening on site, all happening in that single construction site. And each of those subcontractors outsources their labour supply to agencies. And those agencies further subcontract some of the labour that they're supplying to other agencies, etc. And then it gets into the informality and the grey areas, and that's when we have the higher potential for forced labour. So the essential point here is that for companies who are trying to have oversight of what's going on, they know exactly where the forced labour is happening, but they don't know the workers it's happening to, because these are casual workers that come in for a few days and then they go away. They're very hard to spot and have full oversight over, and it's very hard to both find these problems and to deal with them. So this was a paper that we published a couple of years ago in Regulation and Governance, looking at the kind of governance issues around this, right? So how do firms get to tackle it? And then this led to a range of different media outcomes, a result on the BBC and in the trade press, such as Supply Management, talking about this slavery blind spot. Why can't firms identify modern slavery? And we say here it's a result of this kind of labour supply chain, not just the product supply chain, which is how we typically think about these things. So that was one side, thinking about these kind of supply chains, how they intersect with regulation and governance, and why that gives rise to modern slavery, and indeed it ends up perpetuating it. The second part I want to talk about is about the strategies and management, which again deals with some of the supply chain issues and the regulation and governance, but focuses in this context, particularly some human resource management practices, which again, our conclusion is they enable and perpetuate modern slavery. And here we're looking at a project thinking more about global supply chains, and in particular, the focus of this project is on South India and Tamil Nadu. And this is a situation where there have been various reports in the garment industry, in the clothing industry, coming out of Tamil Nadu, of situations of modern slavery. So reports, for example, by the India Committee of the Netherlands and the Clean Clothes Campaign about labour without liberty, talking about kind of bonded migrant workers in the garment industry, again, mobility restrictions and workers held captive in Indian mills supplying Hugo Boss. So a range of big brands across the world sourcing from South India, and very worrying stories about particularly young women being restricted in their freedom of movement in situations of forced labour. So our project was looking at, in a broader sense, at kind of decent work and the potential for decent work in these supply chains. But this problem of mobility restrictions was one that really was very interesting. And so here, we interviewed lots and lots of people. We did over 130 interviews with all kinds of different stakeholders in this space. And to cut a long story short, this is essentially the hostel problem as we identified it. So really, this is the problem not so much as what happens in the factories, but what happens in the migrant hostels that the factories own and operate. So when any workers come from rural areas, which is the major proportion of new workers into the textile industry in Tamil Nadu, they get housed in these hostels, and young women, as you see here, this is a factory owner explaining it to us. Female workers are restricted. He says they cannot move freely outside the hostel. That is a secure area. No one can enter or go out without permission. Their safety is taken care of. We don't let them go outside regularly. We speak to their parents too regarding this, right? It's not a secret. There's outing time. We take them to the city. We give them 3 hours time, and that's the free time allowed by the company. And here's another one, another factory owner. We take them to the city for shopping through our buses. Then we bring them back. The warden, so the hostel warden, accompanies them for these trips. They don't work on Sundays, but we take them out only once a month. So the essential problem here is we have young women who are allowed out once a month for 3 hours on a Sunday, accompanied by a warden. And that's the only time they leave the premises of the business, whether it's the factory or the hostel. So a clear violation of human rights, right, in terms of freedom of movement, and potentially something that might be akin to modern slavery, and certainly that's how it's been presented by the media and by many NGOs. But when we were doing interviews with workers and their families around this, we went back to their villages. We talked about these kind of situations and why they arose. A slightly different picture emerged that we thought was very interesting. So this is a family member talking about the village now where a women worker was from. If she comes home, back to the village, she has to stay inside the house. We don't let them out of the village at all due to this problem of safety they have in the villages. We don't let them out of the house alone. And so if you talk to the workers, which one do you like most? The home, your home back in the village, or the hostel? I like the hostel more because we can have fun over there. And what emerged from this was a sense that that although women workers were restricted, very badly restricted inside the hostel, that very much reflected their experience in general of home life as well. And in fact, they felt they had, in a sense, more liberty, more freedom in the hostel than they would at home. So we called this a kind of hybrid freedom. The experience, according to women workers, is that yes, they experience constraint. This is one of the main functions of hostels, but also hostels offer protection, so some kind of freedom here for the workers from dangers of various sorts, and also offers them liberation. And this is a working paper that we go into much more detail on what these look like. But the big picture of this kind of hybrid freedom, is it emerged from the demands of factories and the demands of their families on the one side, which are driven by this kind of broader economic and cultural context, this broader kind of paternalism in the kind of situation in which they emerge, as well as the kind of demands of brands, which influence the demands of factories. So it's very convenient for the brands to have this situation where they keep workers inside, they're always on call. It's part of what many people in this literature would regard as a very kind of exploitative situation. But at the same time, relatively speaking, it also offers these degrees of protection and liberation. So how do suppliers respond? Then they get, the brands then say, no, we can't have this restriction of freedom, but we still want you to produce at low cost, and we still want you to make sure you have a steady supply of cheap migrant workers. And so it leaves the suppliers in a problem then of whether they then try and deal with this problem or not. And we can perhaps talk about some of their responses in the Q&A, but in the interest of time, I'll move on to what this kind of means, the kind of so what. So what we're left with here is to some extent an alternative to this idea of modern slavery as a binary between either free or unfree, right? As people who are either paid or unpaid, who have agency or don't have agency. That what we get here is actually quite, the freedom these women experience is quite complex and multidimensional and a fairly paradoxical experience. That hostels simultaneously enable some degrees of freedom as well as this heavy dose of unfreedom at the same time. But as a result of that, this kind of hybrid freedom, what this means is that things are unlikely to change, right? That because it's a hybrid form of freedom, because there's these kind of positive aspects wrapped up in it, or perceived positive aspects, it limits any realistic options for change. So the suppliers that operate these hostels, they're able to continue exploiting young female hostel workers. But because they offer protection, because they have a degree of liberation for them, they face little demand for change. And even the families and the workers themselves are resistant to change because of some of the benefits that these situations give. So it becomes very difficult. So my last slide then, just as I kind of pull this together, this is what we've been doing to try and take this work then out back into India. So on the right, you'll see a kind of roundtable that we organised in Bangalore, both in this work around hostels as well as the broader debate that we think this is embedded in terms of decent work. And a report that we published last year, which you can find online at the website there at go.bath.ac.uk, Good Garments. We've been having these conversations, and in fact we're supposed to be back in India this year. It got cancelled, we couldn't do it, to kind of take these further. So to conclude then, the basic point here is that business plays a major role in perpetuating modern slavery. Much of our research shows that. But it can also play an important role in tackling it, but we think it kind of has to go in a different direction. Management research has said very little about how to tackle this, but the research that we are working on would suggest that the kind of standard ways of dealing with this, right, of organising for sustainability, such as auditing, compliance, transparency, the standard things that we have out there are fairly ineffective in combating modern slavery. So what do we need? Well, we need new approaches for management. We also need new research to evaluate these and to explore them. And we can talk about these in the questions, but essentially we're talking about how much intermediation there should be in these supply chains of products and labour and how we can reduce that, how value is distributed in supply chains, how business models work, who gets to say what's responsible in these supply chains, whether it's brands at the top or workers at the bottom, and then whether modern slavery should be exceptionalised as something that's different and separate or embedded within a broader attempt to tackle exploitation in a more general sense. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you, Stefano.
Thank you, Andrew. Perfect timing. I'm going to ask you to unshare your desktop so we can pull up the pictures of the panelists. In the meanwhile, I have received 3 questions, plus I have one on my own. I'm going to ask you 2 questions at a time. Thank you, first of all, for leading us through a less binary way of thinking about free and unfree labor. And also to confirm that we really need to pay attention about the organization of human resources. The couple of examples you gave us are quite poignant in that respect. In the food sector, has to do with contractual forms and sort of daily laborers and the management of the ups and downs of agriculture and food demand and what it means for freedoms and unfreedoms. And then you spent a little bit more time looking at the garment sector and the hybrid nature of freedom and unfreedom, given with a focus on housing conditions. I mean, on the migrant hostels and their relations with the factories. Thank you very much for that. I will start reading the first two questions for you. The first one is from Ana Rita Dominguez and is the following. In the absence of regulation, considering the complex supply chain, who should be accountable for the use of modern slavery? And here refers to your phases in the supply chain. And so it says P1, 2, 3, or 4, all of them? That's the first question. The second question is from Lotte Thompson, who's a colleague at CBDS, and goes as follows. I may have missed this in the beginning of your lecture. She came in a bit later. But how do you define modern slavery? So let's go back to that. And how does it differ from forced labor? Also, do you see any tendencies that are particular to today, current forms of global capitalism? We have seen these problems in garment factories and dormitories in South Asia and Southeast Asia for many years. So I'll leave you with these two for the time being.
Yeah, there's a lot embedded in those. So in terms of legal accountability or accountability, moral responsibility for dealing with these problems, whichever of those two levels we might think about. And first, I don't think we need to think about just in the absence of legal accountability, because we need to think more about how we can instill legal accountability. I mean, at the basic level, there is legal accountability for the person that is, if you like, operating slavery, and so that, which wouldn't be the P1, P2, P2. It would be the L 4, 5, 6, who is actually doing this in the black area. So there is that's right at the bottom of the supply chain. So the question, I think, is getting at how do we have other forms of accountability for brands or suppliers or others. And I don't think it's an either or, but clearly, most of the research around global value chains puts a lot of the focus on lead firms, right, big brands, because they have the vulnerability, if you like, in terms of their brand reputation. But I don't think it's not always a healthy way of looking at these problems, because then you get very top-down solutions, which are not always the most effective. So we may think about forms of accountability, but maybe not accountability just to solve the problems, but to support solutions elsewhere, which I think sometimes is a more helpful way of thinking about it. And sometimes you might think, okay, workers should be enabled to solve these problems themselves with more worker-driven social responsibility. And then what should we expect different actors in the supply chain to contribute to addressing that? So there's always going to be a degree of, so what things do we allocate responsibility for, and what are the mechanisms of doing it? So I'm afraid I'm not going to give you an easy answer on that, but we need to think in those different kind of variegated ways. As for the definition, I did give the definition at the beginning, which was really about the powers attaching to the rights of ownership. But how is it different from forced labour, which is an important one? So generally, modern slavery is a poorly defined umbrella construct for things that include forced labour, forced marriage, sometimes child labour, bonded labour, all kinds of things within that, which often have a more specific definition. So with our UK project, we used forced labour to operationalise modern slavery, because it has a much tighter definition and a more easily operationalised empirically definition, even still complicated. But in the India project, we were interested in these particular questions around freedom of movement, and we didn't talk about slavery at all. Right? This is an issue which is talked about as slavery, but it's not always helpful to call it that, because that immediately means that no one's going to talk to you about the issue, right? And it's not how anyone thinks about it in the context either, right? If you talk to a worker, are you in slavery, they wouldn't think they were. If you could detail specific incidents of their experience, are you allowed out at the weekend? Are you allowed out after work? They can specify yes or no, and you can get to a situation which might then be able to be defined in certain ways or not. But it becomes very difficult. As soon as you get the definitions, you do enter into these kind of binaries it either is or it isn't, and it becomes quite problematic in other ways. So it's a challenge that we have as researchers always, that we want to get into the complexity of the situation, but also we have to have some neat categories to put things in.
Thank you very much. We have quite a number of questions, so I'm going to go and pick up the next three now, and then I'll let you decide how well, you will have to be tight in the answer. So the first one is from Juliane Lang, who is actually from tomorrow, a PhD student in our center. Could you talk a bit more about the supplier responses, which was also a question I wanted to ask you. Next is Ma Rafi Atal, who is a postdoc at our center as well. And the question is the following. The cultural context for these hostels takes into account how families are already treating their daughters. But did you explicitly compare this to hostels with male workers? Or do any of the buyers have factories with male workers in their supply chains? If so, are they treated the same and perhaps respond differently given the cultural context, or treated differently? And if so, is that a form of gender discrimination on the part of the firms? The third question is from Peter Lund Thompson, also a CBDS and presenting later on. Peter says, I have mixed feelings about the notion of modern slavery. Traditionally, it was the European colonial nations and the US, including companies in these countries, that were responsible for the global slave trade. Denmark is no exception to this. Now we are researchers tasked with investigating, quote, modern slavery, without looking at our own history in the slave trade. A number of incisive questions.
Yeah.
I'll 5-6 minutes, and then we'll have the last round. Okay?
Okay.
Thanks.
Let me start with the second one first, which is the cultural context and male workers. Yeah, so male workers do not have the same experience in hostels at all. And the response we got, in fact, from the factory owners and the wardens was male workers wouldn't accept this. And so there's no attempt to impose the same kind of conditions on them. This is a highly gendered experience from female workers. And also partly that's because the drivers of this, so some of the ideas of the protection that is being sought here are protections of perceived honour and virginity of female workers. So if they're locked in, there's no way they can elope with anybody. There's no way they can go out and have a relationship with anybody. And that's regarded as important when they go back to their home village to get married. There's no such expectation of the male workers. So it's a very highly gendered experience as a result. The supplier responses are fascinating in many ways. So, on the one side, some factories then say, okay, so the buyer says no more modern slavery, you have to stop this, but at the same time, you still have to produce at this price point, in which case you have to pay your workers this, and female workers are the main people who are willing to accept these low wages. So they're caught in a bind. They can't get female workers very easily unless they offer these hostile arrangements. So either they kind of avoid some of these demands, which might mean that they say, okay, we'll give up doing hostels, and then we have to find workers another way. That's a very risky approach. Sometimes they take another avoidance strategy and say, okay, we'll move to where the workers are. We'll stop hiring migrant workers and go to rural areas and relocate our factories. But more typically, the most common response is to try and keep these two things going at the same time, which means they try and hide what's going on. And they often operate these hostels either beyond the kind of remit of brand audits and brand oversight. So they keep them kind of two things balanced at the same time, trying to juggle them and keep it going like that. But privately to us, they actually say, no, these people don't understand India. They don't understand the demands of workers, and this is not modern slavery. This is not wrong. Just 1 minute then on Peter's question. Modern slavery, it's a very slippery term, absolutely, and you have to use it very cautiously, I'd say, in all the research. And and to explore it when we're using it. I think if we use it uncritically, then we do fall into major problems. But actually, we can't do every project by taking into account the full history of everything, but certainly in terms of the history and context and culture of a region, we need to take seriously when we're talking about these sorts of problems, because they emerge from existing cultural practices, from existing kind of arrangements of gender relations and other things, and otherwise they don't make any sense.
Thank you, Andy. I'm going to go on and ask you another set of 3 questions. There will be more questions that will be available in the meeting chat for you to purse later on. The first one is from Lisa Enrici, who's a professor at CBDS. Well, the question is the following. Could you reflect for us a bit more on the links between interconnectedness of freedom/unfreedom? If forced labor/modern slavery is the dystopian imaginary of capitalism, what is its utopian imaginary? There is a second question by her that links back to Peter's point. Then your thoughts on what business studies might gain from taking insights from post-colonial scholarships, and particularly addressing the issue of institutionalized white supremacy. Linked to this, is there a quote-unquote slavery blind spot or profitable whiteness? Then from Luis Bernardo, could you discuss your concept of freedom a bit more? Hybridity depends on its content. Freedom as non-domination, for example, Philippe Petit's proposal, suggests that hybrid freedom is not very hybrid, as it does not allow workers in hostels to live without being under the thumb of hostel owners, supply chain brokers, or brands. They remain unfree in this sense, though secure. Then we have Matthew Archer, who's a postdoc at CBDS as well. He has 2 questions. I'm going to ask you the first one only, and I'm afraid that we're going to have to wrap up the others. You conclude that business has been a major driver of modern slavery, but could also play a key role in figuring out how to solve the problem. But why do you think that? Doesn't more traditional regulation have a better track record?
Okay, great, wonderful questions. So to Lisa's question, let me put them together. What's the kind of utopian imaginary here around freedom? In many ways, what's being demanded here is that, in terms of the hostel situation, is that women are freed, right? So that's the worldview, and that we need to stop this modern slavery. Perfectly reasonable, you might say, but at the same time, it's not currently a sustainable solution very easily, right? That there's demand for some kind of living arrangement that provides various aspects they're looking for. There are alternatives to hostels which could be developed, and that's one thing that we're trying to do here. But the typical kind of imaginary, if you like, is of the kind of abolitionist who comes in and says, we stop the slavery, we close down the hostels, and then we solve the problem. And the whole point of our paper in many ways is say, that's might be counterproductive, and certainly isn't a kind of solution that puts the interests of these women at heart. So that's the kind of the problem. And I think there is a kind of, to some extent, a kind of white supremacy in this argument, is that we must rescue these people. There's a whole kind of rescue mode in the modern slavery discourse, which doesn't really always take into account that there is agency to some extent of workers who might choose these situations for their own reasons, despite being embedded in kind of dominating kind of patriarchal situations. And that goes to Louise's question about freedom and being unfree but secure, and what do we mean by freedom? We try to put it from the point of view of the workers themselves in this paper. Obviously, there's a whole range of different ways we could conceptualize freedom. But the important thing for us was that, what is the experience of freedom in their words? And this is what we tried to get at with this. Now, we could certainly impose different kind of normative conceptions of freedom upon those, but we wanted to get at the lived experience. And then finally, this kind of why should business be a part of the solution? Yeah, I mean, regulation can work for sure, and regulation is absolutely a major part of any solution to any of these problems. But there is also a role always, I would say, for business to play. If they're going to resist regulation, then that's going to be a problem. If they're going to try and evade regulation that is there, we know that they can do that. So how do we kind of think about regulation that's actually going to be effective and work? Is part of the question, and how can we perhaps get business involved in solutions which aren't just about regulation, but are about giving rights to workers and enabling them to express those rights in the workplace. And sometimes that's through things such as collective action and those sorts of things, and then collective bargaining, irrespective of what the law says, and enabling those to happen. So yes, it absolutely needs to be part of it, but I would always argue that there needs to be some kind of thinking about how these things intersect.
Thank you very much, Andy. We still have a few minutes, so I'm going to pick up 2 more questions from people who haven't intervened yet. I have multiple questions from people who have been heard already. So Carlos Santana, congratulations for your bottom-up approach to enlightening the embedded complexity with the relation employee and employer. If there are benefits that involve that the employers are more interested to obtain, which an intervention could take away. Definitely, policy implementation in all levels and chains could be relevant to protect employees. I guess this is more of a comment and not a question, but I thought I would read it to you. Then there's a question from Dinah. How does categorizing, Dinah Rajek, how does categorizing some kinds of relations as slavery/forced labor have the unintended outcome to effectively legitimize other relations as voluntary or agential? For example, dire economic need factor as a form of coercion. Back to you just for a few minutes.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the bottom up, that's certainly something that we're trying to do with this project. So most of the solutions are out there for almost everything around sustainability, but absolutely in the case of kind of working conditions and modern slavery, these kind of top-down, right, brand-led kind of responses. And what we're trying to do here is understand the views both of workers and supplier firms in terms of how they dealt with these kind of employment relationship issues, and trying to find solutions that were actually appealing to both of those sides. Because we found, as many studies have, right, that audits and those sorts of things are, very successfully avoided, cheated, and evaded by suppliers with the willing confederacy of workers in the supply chain. So trying to find solutions that appeal to them at the bottom is very important to this project, and we focus on that a lot in the project report if anyone wants to take a look. And then in terms of the binaries of modern slavery and not slavery, freedom, unfreedom, and how it legitimizes other relations, that's part of the problems of exceptionalism for sure, right? That if you can say, yeah, we've got this terrible stuff happening over here in modern slavery, stamp that out and everything else becomes a voluntary business relationship, a voluntary employment relationship, and it ignores all the things around 0-hour contracts and precarious work of various sorts. That's part of the problem, absolutely. And so that's why on the one side, we have to think about the people in the worst forms of exploitation because that's important. But that, in terms of our research, we often see that as a kind of wedge to open up the question about, okay, to solve this, you need to think about how value is distributed in your supply chain. To solve this, you need to think about the business model of the firm focusing on low-wage workers. So rather than just say, to solve this, you close down a hostel, which would be a kind of exceptionalist response, it's about trying to think of solutions which avoid the exceptionalism and try and get at the deeper systemic problem, which is about low-wage work and precarious work in general.
Thank you very much, Andy. Thanks a lot for your presentation and discussion. We have had, and thanks for all our participants and the
absolutely
stringent questions for Andy. At this point, I would like to thank Andy and call in Dinah Rajek for her presentation. Dina Rajak is reader in anthropology and international development, and also in anthropology and international development in the School of Global Studies, University of Sussex. Dina's research interests lie at the intersection of anthropology of development and global capitalisms, plural. Particular areas of focus include the role of transnational corporations in development, corporate social responsibility, and moral economy. Also, she's interested in extractive industries, and in particular in sub-Saharan Africa. She's also a member of the advisory board of CBDS, and we're very thankful for her role in that. Other areas of her interest include economic empowerment, enterprise and entrepreneurialism, and the role of big business in the political economy of HIV/AIDS management. Her current research explores entrepreneurship, youth employment, bottom-of-the-pyramid approaches to development, and concepts of inclusive markets. She is a co-founder of the Center for New Economies of Development and author of, among others, 2 books that I would like to signal here. One is In Good Company, An Anatomy of Social Corporate Responsibility, and she's also co-editor of The Anthropology of Corporate Social Responsibility. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Dina. Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much, Stefano, for that really generous, over-generous introduction, and also for inviting me and having me to speak. I would like to say I'm thrilled to be here, but given that here is actually where I have been sitting for the last 6 months, I would much rather be in Copenhagen, or to be honest, pretty much anywhere other than the UK and maybe a couple of other countries at the moment. But I'm really thrilled to be doing something very different this afternoon, and have already been very stimulated by this engagement. So without further ado, I'm going to attempt to share my screen now with my presentation, and hopefully this will work. If it doesn't work, will somebody shout at me somehow, or raise a hand or something? Okay. Right. Okay.
Perfect. Dina.
Good. Great. Fantastic. Thanks, Stefano. So first and foremost, just to say, this is actually, I'm presenting on behalf of myself and Catherine Dolan, who's a long-term collaborator, and this is research we've done together, and we've done it with Getwiri Kimathi, who's also a long-term research assistant of ours on the ground in Kenya, we've been working for a long time, and of course that is becoming even more important now that we're all sort of landlocked, as it were. So I speak on behalf of all 3 of us. It's research that was done between 2017 and 2019 in Nairobi, France, and the UK. The other thing I should say is that I'm talking about a specific program here in a specific company, and unlike previous work, in this particular instance, the company made it clear to us that total and utter anonymization was absolutely critical to us being able to use the data. So it's very, very heavily anonymized. What that means is that none of the pictures that I'm showing you are actually pictures from the research or of any participants. All the names have been changed, countries have been changed, not Nairobi, but around the companies and so on and so forth. So just to make that clear. Okay, so last year, Coca-Cola convened, last year as in 2019, convened an expert, what they called an expert conversation on empowering women at London's very swanky Somerset House. And this drew together 20 or so experts from business, academia, government, and NGOs to discuss the company's ambitious financial foray into the women's economic empowerment space, which is the kind of area that Catherine and I would be interested in. And during the coffee break, and so often the really interesting things happen in coffee breaks, Coca-Cola presented each of us with a small gift. And this was a handcrafted bag, exquisite, made from recycled Coca-Cola bottle caps and crocheted by women artisans in the third world, as they put it. The artisans are part of Coca-Cola's award-winning Women's Economic Empowerment Program, 5 by 20, which aims to arm 5 million women across its supply chain with entrepreneurial business skills and market access by the end of 2020. So they've got a few months left to go. I suppose, like all of us, they'll claim kind of COVID extension. As part of Coca-Cola's commitment to partnership, or what the company terms leveraging the golden triangle, which I just think is a great phrase, the golden triangle of business, civil society and government. I think at the moment we've got a kind of Bermuda triangle of business, civil society and government going on here. So I'd like to see a golden triangle. But in their attempt to leverage this, the company sought to elevate its corporate engagement to the vanguard of development, claiming that uplifting women will recharge the world, as that's their phrase. Since the early 2000s, of course, entrepreneurship has gained favor as a way for corporations to penetrate untapped markets under the banner of development. They're looking to tap into new markets, but of course they're also interested in so many other things that reside at this so-called bottom of the pyramid, like social capital and embeddedness and kind of relations and effective relations and all these kinds of things. And I'll come on to that later. And women have been at the forefront of such initiatives as transnational corporations, often in partnership with development community kind of leaders and international financial institutions and NGOs and so on, look to the power of inclusive markets to repurpose the iconic enterprising woman for a new era of millennial capitalism. Of course, in some ways, I should say there's nothing new here. Women have animated development imaginary since Mary Tiffin's kind of iconic enterprising peasant of the 60s, or the market seller that we find in kind of Graciela Clark's work of the 70s, or the microcreditee of the 90s. Now, however, dubbed the third billion by corporations and development donors, the enterprising woman adeptly parlays poverty into enterprise. So she's been given a kind of more of a business spin, repurposed from a beneficiary of development to an engine of profit and growth. And here then I think we could say we find a sort of new wave, kind of neoliberal feminist ideology, one that Margaret Thatcher might have been terribly proud of, amenable to corporate agendas and best encapsulated in the World Bank's aphorism, gender equality is smart economics. So this new orthodoxy of inclusive markets reformulates older registers of economic integration, as it so often does. And the other, I suppose, paradigm here that's being reinvented and reimagined are the modes of adverse incorporation, to use Nicola Phillips's resonant phrase there. And these are kind of being, I suppose, reimagined now to position women not as workers in the global economy, but as drivers of inclusive growth. So celebrating women as authors of their own upliftment, but also delegating them, in fact, as drivers of broader social transformation. So you've got a sort of double burden there as a newly empowered entrepreneurial African woman, that not just to uplift yourself and your family and your household, but also to be responsible for the kind of economic growth of your nation. As UN Women claims, empowering young women to become not only wage earners, but also job creators is imperative for eradicating poverty. So this kind of female entrepreneur becomes a social multiplier. That's the idea. And that's why you get these huge scale numbers, these numbers of massive magnitude. It's a kind of idea of exponential growth, right? You empower one woman, and then you set in motion this ripple effect, this multiplier effect, as Catherine Merler puts it, to ripple across multiple development indicators from the scale of the family to the world. Take the risk, exhorted the UN Women empower champion at the launch of the global coalition of women entrepreneurs in 2016. Invest your money, invest your time, invest your passion in order to empower other people. So such compelling narratives are combined with very ambitious numbers, as we've seen. For example, A&M, the parent company of Ann Taylor and Loft and a whole bunch of other sort of retail shops, mainly in the garment sector, pledged to empower 100,000 women in its global supply chain by 2019. Goldman Sachs, it was only 10,000 women, but the numbers are smaller, yes, but the multiplier they promised was much bigger, targeting women's enterprise with potential for huge exponential growth if you look at their numbers. Magasin, as we're calling it, one of the world's top 10 retailers on which our research is focused, has been looking to source billions of euros of their supply chain from women entrepreneurs, and that's a quote from one of their executives. So their aim was, as the quote continues, to harness the vast reach of its supply chain, of our supply chain, and the immense scale of our customer base as a means of empowering enterprising women across the globe. And to achieve this, Magasin launched a framework that they called Le Réseau de Femmes Entrepreneurs, which is we're calling RFE, a kind of network, a platform of entrepreneurial women, which was intended to empower women as entrepreneurs by bringing them into their supply chain. But this is about, they stressed, much more than just sourcing from women entrepreneurs or expanding Magasin's vast base of low-cost producers, which includes over 1 million suppliers. RFE's architects stressed that it was conceived as an inclusive infrastructure, as they put it, to give market access to the base of the pyramid, to artisans, to small women-owned business in a way that will empower them, their families, their communities, and the wider world. What Catherine and I found particularly interesting here was that a lot of the work that we had done and many others had done on the bottom of the pyramid had always focused on the sort of last mile distribution or retail end of it, the consumption, the selling, the kind of double value proposition that comes with, you can become a seller, and on the back of that you sell these products, you can then parlay that into becoming an entrepreneur. But this was very much a new raft, engaged a new raft of multinationals in the possibility of BOP production. So kind of harnessing the BOP register, the bottom of the pyramid register, to engage producers, not just sellers. So women entrepreneurs as producers. And so it's this infrastructure is targeted very much at recruiting, I suppose, much more top of the bottom of the pyramid entrepreneurs, who then will kind of cascade or ripple this empowerment down to their workers and their employees and spark kind of new ventures and through this social multiplier. So what I want to try to do with the time that I have remaining is just to give you a very brief snapshot following one particular social enterprise that Magasin set its sights on, which we're calling MK Designs, MK Designs, based in Nairobi, on its journey to inclusion in Magasin's global marketplace. And just to kind of highlight some of the contradictions that came out of that journey and some of the various aspects of that relationship that frustrated and confounded that celebration of empowerment, let's say. Okay, so as we followed Mkiwa through that process of inclusion, a central paradox really emerged, this central paradox that we see to be at the heart of corporate-sponsored inclusive market schemes. Under the banner of empowerment and autonomy, RFE ushered in new regimes of patronage and clientelism for Magasin's local partners like Mkiwa, whose agency, and that's agency in financial, managerial, ethical, and aesthetic matters, became ever more constrained rather than enabled or liberated. And key was local embeddedness, was precisely the very resource on which Magasin was keen to capitalize. You know, this was actually a successful small enterprise embedded in Nairobi's design and jewellery and garment production markets. And so they're very keen to capitalize on that. But to do so, in fact, Mkiwa had to abandon their local customer base and their sites of production in favour of an export processing incubator supposed to nurture their growth aspirations, and also abandon their particular design and aesthetic sensibilities in favour of the aesthetic expectations of a distinct clientele as it was presented to them. The role, and one thing just in a really kind of, I suppose, policy directed, which is rare for anthropologists to speak in such policy directed ways, but that I think came out of this research for us. A key finding was that the role of domestic markets is not only overlooked in paradigms of inclusive growth, the kind that are celebrated in SDG 7 or 8, but they're really actively sidelined, allowing for value resources in the form of human, social and financial capital that circulate within them to be extracted from those domestic economies and transferred to the global market, kind of piped up the value chain to corporations. And what that means is the actual fuel, the actual engine of growth, which is sits very much in that kind of small and medium-sized wholesaler, local, sort of local markets of wholesalers, and also those selling to direct customers there, is being imperiled in a very significant way as local enterprise are being pushed to these markers of success, which is growth, looking globally. So a fundamental question we ask throughout this is this disempowerment by inclusion? As the vehicle for Magasin's will to empower, RFE invokes the ethical conscience of both the corporate giant, so all these executives we spent a long time talking to, and the ideal shopper. They have more of a global understanding, they have a different motivation for what they buy and why they buy it, is how one of RFE's in-house champions, a Magasin executive, explained it. And then she went on, she wants really cute stuff. She kind of just took that for granted, that the ideal shopper is of course a woman. She wants really cute stuff at good prices. So while the enterprising woman stands as the target of this corporate model of market inclusion, it's the female shopper that is positioned as driver, both ethically and aesthetically. The function of RFE is to provide a marketplace where the two can meet. And like Nike's Girl Effect, this story of interconnected global womanhood is inseparable from the aesthetic value of the product and instrumental to RFE's commercial success. So Delphine, the director of RFE, explained that the fact is our customers are majority women. It just makes good sense for us to be in this space. And as a result, RFE sits somewhat uncomfortably between core business and corporate largesse. On the one hand, RFE serves Magasin's boundless desire to expand its its supplier base to potentially more lucrative peripheries at the base of the pyramid, a frontier of capital where the raw entrepreneurial energies of the poor represent new possibilities for profit. But on the other hand, RFE is also run as a kind of submural philanthropic project of senior executives who want to connect with this higher purpose of kind of universal women's self-empowerment. And so George Andrews, the director of Global Bazaar, remarked what Magasin wants to do. Global Bazaar is the partner that's an NGO partner that they're working through to find and recruit these locally based SMEs. What Magasin wants to do is two things simultaneously. They want to do good, no doubt. In my mind, I've known them for a long time, he said, but they've got to sell product. And that, of course, was the bottom line. And through our kind of ethnographic work, making these two cohere, translating Magasin's low-cost production model into a social mission, turned out to be rather less seamless than they had anticipated. Okay, so just to touch on a few elements of that. What is absolutely pushed to recruits is scalability. So trying to find the right target is crucial, and this was really pressed upon Global Bazaar. You've got to find SMEs that are both small enough to qualify as base of the pyramid, otherwise we can't really valorize our claims to empowerment, but they're going to have to be established enough to actually genuinely be able to scale. And they've got to show their spark and mettle through their desire for growth and for scaling. And this is how Magasin met Mkiwa, and how it set its sights on Mkiwa, as having that charismatic mix of entrepreneurial ambitions and kind of authentic Kenyan aesthetics. Mkiwa had been doing very well for over a decade, since Tessa Candy and her cousin Sonia Mayo set it up. Tessa on the business side, Sonia on the design side. She had been a jewellery designer, and Tessa had, once her children were grown, ferreted enough money away to say, okay, let's try and start this business. And they'd done well, and they had a staff of on informal but contracts, but a very happy staff working in a workshop in the back of Tessa's house, behind her house, of a staff of between about 20 and 30, and they also sourced further work from some rural women's weaving collectives. And long before Mkiwa had joined Magasin's RFE, she had been driven, she articulated her drive as not just entrepreneurial, but that entrepreneurship was very much aligned with her own will, personal will to empower. So she said, I started business, I was just looking at trying to help somebody change their life, to create employment, and to recruit women who were, selling, working as informal washerwomen in the slums. Now, one thing that became really clear to us doing this research was that in itself was a huge resource that companies like Magasin are looking to capitalize in. And we're calling that the sort of affective value, I suppose, affective, as of entrepreneurs like Tessa, who've become not just targets for empowerment themselves, for scaling and growth and inclusion, but brokers of that promise, from the corporation down to the kind of the base of the pyramid. And that her own incredibly both maternal but also very I suppose kind of tiger mummish in a way, aspirations for her own workers and her own will to empower and to free them and to sort of catalyze them into their own trajectories of growth was something that Magasin very cannily had already seen was a great a resource and an asset for multinationals. So in the same way that they've always looked to find brokers to penetrate markets, to get their products into markets, you need kind of local allies and individuals who can do that kind of brokerage role. It's the same on the production side, and that was very much what entrepreneurs like Tessa represented for them. So chief among the entrepreneurial virtues that RFE was looking for in recruiting SMEs like Mkiwa and then Hope to Stoke was the capacity to think big, right? So George Andrews, director of Global Bazaar, said, if Magasin were ever to come up to you and say, would you like to do business with Magasin? The answer is, hell yes, I do, even though you might not know what that means yet, because you've got to think big if you're ever going to get there. Now, I don't have a lot of time left, so I'm just going to try and skim through the rest very, very quickly, which is that what was stressed over and over to us by executives in Magasin and the kind of shepherds within Global Bazaar who had been contracted by Magasin to guide and convert and transform these SMEs into good suppliers ready for inclusion, to create readiness to create these conversions. What was stressed was that yes, they might already have the spark and the metal, but they're going to need training, they're going to need transformation, they're going to need personal, institutional kind of reconfiguration to create those mindsets that render them fit for global markets. And that was a process. As Delphine put it, the director of RFE, how do we educate these women businesses enough to know how to be suppliers? It's like they're going to have to start becoming, and there was that word that ever since Michelle Obama's wonderful autobiography is so resonant with the sort of almost mystical blossoming of female self-actualization. But this didn't turn out to be a process of beautiful blossoming, because, as I said at the beginning, the objectives don't cohere. There isn't a win-win here. There is a win-win, I should say. There was a win-win for Magasin, though not the most obvious one of making profit, because I'm not quite sure that RFE is that profitable directly. But it doesn't translate as a win-win for SMEs like Mkiwa. The rewards of joining RFE are enticing. That think big. If Magasin ever come up to you and say, do you want to join us? The answer is hell yes. It's very enticing. It's very hard for even successful small enterprises like Magasin to say, actually, no. You know, the not just the ideal of growth, but also there are real hard rewards that are held out. For instance, access to design mentoring, lines of credit, which are often denied by Kenyan banks to women-owned enterprises with often come at prohibitive interest rates, and also the sort of credentials to then appeal to other global retailers. But in exchange for these benefits, small women-owned enterprises must be prepared to make sacrifices. That was made clear, but what wasn't made clear was the scale of these sacrifices, the cost, I should say, the human cost, the emotional cost, and the financial cost. First and foremost, for Mkiwa, this meant relinquishing a significant degree of their profit margin to Magasin, reducing their margin to just 10% on each item as opposed to 50%. Plus they got from local trade. Second, and more surprisingly, given the emphasis on empowerment and autonomy, it meant sacrificing independence and security. And what in the longer paper that we've produced on the back of this we go through is the different areas where that training, which translates as a corporate disciplining, constrains that agency. So on one level, it is the classic ethical codes of conduct and the kinds of disciplining that brings with it. Actually, Andrew touched on in a very different way. Actually, it relates to what you were talking about, which was companies coming in and saying, oh, well, there are children in the workplace here, we must shut this down and you must move to an incubator, even though then nobody asks, well, who are going to be looking after those children then? That's another cost that's passed down. So there's ethical discipline. There is aesthetic discipline. Again, this, yes, we want the authentic Kenyan beaded barrettes, but not like that, because that's not exactly what will appeal to the European customer. And it has to be a bit like, so there's an ethical and an aesthetic disciplining. And then there's a disciplining around, of course, time, space, the ergonomics of production. Why are women sitting on the floor when they're weaving? They should be sitting in there's a sort of the truths, the ergonomic truths of what is the right occupational health and safety positions, where is the right place to work, what are the right working hours. So you have a disciplining of time, you have a disciplining of space. This meant, in fact, moving the workshop 2 hours away from Nairobi into an incubator hub that was supposed to support small enterprises, but of course meant that their workers then couldn't afford to get there in time or money, and so they had to be subsidized by TESA. All of these various levels of disciplining in order to scale and in order to become a supplier left the business risk-ridden and actually very, very financially leveraged, but it also left Tessa and Sonia and their workers exhausted emotionally. And I think that's one thing I want to just come to before I conclude. is that the cost of inclusion, and I'm calling it inclusion here, although I think it's clear now that this is a new form of adverse incorporation. The cost is often described in terms of the way in which it can imperil small business, it can create new risks, and all along this is sold as very much the true spirit of the entrepreneur, to be risky, to take risks, to take that gamble. But the cost is, of course, profoundly emotional, and the way in which that is legitimized is through this deferral to the idea of resilience, as it is now more than ever, that Tessa and Sonia were expected to be resilient after setback after setback after setback. Barrettes sent back, or tote bags sent back because they were the wrong shade of dye or they weren't standardized enough. The setbacks and the constant emotional stress of that. The entrepreneur is supposed to be resilient, risk-taking, and to create a ripple effect. And that also wears out the emotional capital and the physical and intellectual capital of really important brokers like Tessa. In the meantime, corporations are celebrated for not being impatient, right? To have absolutely kind of just now production, this is our pace, the pace must be relentless. So you have this very much this kind of temporal friction going on, and the expectations are not balanced. Sorry, this was just to say that the product despite the aesthetic disciplining, they were all then labeled with the made in Kenya, because what is celebrated here, what's supposed to appeal to the shopper, as long as it still looks not too authentic, but it looks authentic enough that it can convey a story. And that story is, as Jeanette would tell us, the story is what sells. So when you buy that hair barrette, you want it to be a story of kind of exotic, aesthetic, but you also want that story in itself to give you a feeling of empowerment. So, as Tessa said, this was a very frustrating.
Sorry, Dinah. I think we're going to have to wrap it up a bit.
Okay, so I'm just going to skip now to my conclusion, which really sits around this question of whether this ripple effect is of course, a trickle-down reinvented. Sonia said to us towards the end of our time, I think it's frustrating for us because we get calls from these women who really need the work, and they're asking us, do they magasin like the sample? So this was the rural weavers collectives that they were sourcing from. What are they saying? And you're trying every time. You tell them that we're still waiting. We're still waiting. So over and over again, there was a great sense of patience that was required. And the silence of magasin executives reminded Sonia and Tessa of their position in the pecking order of RFE's inclusive market relations. This was in no way horizontal. It was clear to them. It also reminded them of their dependence on the scant returns of corporate patronage. Paradoxically, with each new stage of inclusion, the RFE extended to include Tessa and Sonia's agency in their business built over a decade dwindled. I'm just losing control, Tessa said. I'm losing it, and it's wrong. And the reason why we've really focused on the case of Impure is that it reveals the frailty of corporate claims to mutuality, the myths of mutuality on which these promises are placed, and that stoke that bid for inclusion in global supply lines. Thank you, and sorry for going on a bit too long.
Thank you, Dinah. Thank you very much. Thanks for leading us through a couple of very important aspects that go in and out of the current discussions on entrepreneurship, micro-enterprise, and bottom of the pyramid markets, which originally and classically have been mostly about micro retail and consumption of branded goods that are provided by global companies. And so you helped us to move that focus into more of a production side. To what extent top or bottom of the pyramid entrepreneurs then can bring in micro enterprises and workers to be part of the production sort of segment of this kind of entrepreneurship. And Also, about highlighting the tensions between authenticity and but not too much, what it means to design and produce for purely domestic markets, and when the sort of export component comes in, and highlighting whether there are situations in which there may be win-win for some companies, but not for all the enterprise the entrepreneurs involved. You also talked about the possibility of disempowering by inclusion or adverse incorporation, which is old language that we've used in global value chain analysis, but not so much in local and micro sort of entrepreneurship markets. And importantly, what it means in terms of learning, discipline / resilience. So it's a very rich set of materials that you brought into the conversation. I'm aware of the fact that we've been online for 1 hour and 25 minutes now, so I would like to suggest that we take a couple of minutes break, everyone. So we convene at 4 o'clock. In the meanwhile, for those of you who are online, please do type in your questions for Dinah, and I will then read them out to her and weave in a discussion. So it's now 3:56 local time in Denmark. So we'll reconvene in 4 minutes. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming back. And during our short break, we received 2 questions. So I think if Dinah, if you're ready, we can start with those. I'm waiting for more as we go along. So the first question is from Lisa and Richie at CBDS, and it reads as follows. Thanks for an interesting presentation on the gendering of patients across borders. Can you tell us more about your understanding of the ideal shopper as linked to particular and gendered entrepreneurial virtues? Also, how is the affective value linked to distance in the value chain, gendered and colonial imaginaries, and the impossibility for impatience by these Kenyan women? The second question is by our own Peter Lund Thompson. Hi, Dinah. Thank you for your presentation. I'm wondering whether it is still, if ever, made sense to speak of women entrepreneurs in BOP markets. Never understood the latter term and still don't. Okay, back to you.
Yeah, just
Dinah.
by the latter term being BOP markets, is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's my understanding of it. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. Thanks. Yes, Lisa, that's two connected, really useful questions. Actually, useful to us as well. The gendering of patients across borders. I mean, this speaks directly to the effective value and why, as much as you know, I spent so long deconstructing DFID's notion of capital and how simplistic social capital and blah blah. Actually, the idea of a kind of effective capital here is quite effective, is quite useful, and it's just a kind of handy catch word for what. If you're trying to recruit 100,000 last mile distributors of your product or producers and push their price points down and down and down, as Magazine were doing for Mkiwa, you can't just do it with a blunt instrument or with a kind of weapon, right? Like the best way to get people to work really hard for your corporation is also through, you know, as we know, kind of Burrawise, kind of soft forms of coercion, and how you manufacture consent and how you get people to buy into this really quite fraudulent promise of Coca-Cola's empowerment or Magazine's, you know. And that is a kind of, that requires a kind of effective relationship to be formed, an emotional or moral relationship to be formed between your patron, your employer, your recruiter, whatever it is, and you know, the so-called employee at the bottom of the pyramid, whether they're a producer or a retailer or a seller, a last mile seller. And you can't do that at a distance, right? Especially when you don't, when all you have, you might have some brand recognition or you might not. Magazine didn't, it's not Coca-Cola. And so you need brokers and you need people like Tessa, just in the same way that you know, a lot of the big banks couldn't understand why their lower interest financial products targeted at the bottom of the pyramid were not being picked up in rural Indian villages, and people were still going to the loan shark. And then they realized, oh, the loan shark has a kind of moral status in some ways, has status, has power, and has particular kinds of emotional relations, which are a resource we need. So therefore we need to recruit, you know, the loan shark as our agent, as our broker. So I think that's where the effective value at a distance is so important to corporations, and that's a huge resource that they're looking for as they try to capitalize on the bottom of the pyramid, whether it's as a productive resource or as a retail resource. At the same time, what they're then demanding from these brokers, from brokers like Tessa, who themselves have an immense will to empower, is celebrated, as you said, as patience and resilience. Tessa can't be impatient. She can't be impatient despite the long months of silence. What happened to those shipments of hair barrettes we sent back? We don't know whether any of them have even made it onto the floor space. As it turned out, they found out at the end that none of the products they had said had kind of got the golden ticket of making it from online, so they were being sold online, to actually getting shelf space. Shelf space is you know, kind of the ultimate to get shelf space on a magazine shop floor. But they didn't know this for months and months. But that's where the power relations are so reveal themselves so strongly behind these myths of mutuality, is that the corporation can be eternally silent and impatient, but entrepreneurs must be resilient. They must be patient, because being forward thinking is always expected of the entrepreneur, to have your eye on the long horizon, to wait patiently, and the rewards of that risk taking will come, and to be eternally patient. And also then, when Tessa stopped relaying things back to Magazine because she felt very embarrassed, she said by the end of the process she felt she had failed so much. She didn't want to bring her stories, she didn't want to make complaints to Magazine. She didn't want to say, I'm sorry we're late on the shipment, we simply couldn't make your timescale. So she went silent. And that's when Magazine said, oh, well, you know, they're clearly not the entrepreneurs we thought they were, because true entrepreneurs don't go silent, they are confident. So again, you have this incredible imbalance of who can be silent, who can't, who can be patient, who can be impatient. Yes, a BOP market. Well, I mean, I'm using it because, in the way that it is deployed. It's not a neutral term. It's not a. I'm not designating it as a BOP market. I'm talking about what the corporation sees, what corporations, or in fact development institutions, international financial institutions, and banks and so on, see as bottom of pyramid markets. It's the markets that they are tapping into, that they're targeting. They're designating them bottom of the pyramid by saying that these are poor third world consumers or producers that can be made much more, as they put it, relevant and much more productive and utilized by global markets, that are underutilized, in the way the World Bank would say that land is being underproductive, it could be made much more productive. So they're being designated as BOP markets and then acted upon as such. They're not actually bottom of the pyramid, because where it started off as saying, well, this is the bottom billion and they actually have loads of money that we could be kind of sucking up. It's really always the top of the bottom of the bottom pyramid.
Thank you very much, Dinah. I have another question from our own Matthew Archer. At one point in your talk, you seem to be framing Magazine's partnership with artisanal producers in terms of risk, which I find really compelling. I wonder if you could elaborate on that, especially with relation to this concept of affective values. And since we don't have other questions, I will abuse my role as the chairperson to ask you a question. You, some point in the presentation, you were talking about a win-win situation, at the very least, for Magazine. And I would like to ask you, how would a win-win situation that also includes the SMEs look like? What would you expect to see to say, oh, this has really worked out? Thank you.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think that's something really worth thinking through, that we can develop, that you've kind of put your finger on in relation to risk and effective labour there. One thing that I wanted to stress, and I didn't do enough towards the end, you know, I kind of rushed it through, was the emotional cost, but also the emotional labour here. And again, that's a huge resource, it's a huge asset. We know it's always an asset. It's how employers are able to drive down terms and conditions and pay, is through relying on the emotional labour and the emotional commitment. And we see it in, you know, NHS frontline heroes in the UK and teachers today, but thinking through that in relation to risk. So risk is something that is valorized as the true kind of hallmark of the entrepreneur, the capacity, the willingness to take risk. But taking risk, even if you are, however much it's celebrated and heroized, risk-taking in itself is very hard work. And so there's a huge amount of emotional labour that goes into scaling up. It's draining and it's exhausting. And I think right now as probably not in Denmark, where I imagine everything is being governed kind of very well. But as anybody in the UK right now may well be feeling, the sense of having to constantly, even just for one's own household, make daily risk assessments and policy discussions. Okay, do we get on a train and commute to London? Do we not? Or do we go to this medical appointment or not? Where are the parameters of risk? Do we allow our children to go back to football practice? It's open, the government says it's fine, we're not so sure, our infection rate. The number of calculations and the way in which those calculations are actually embedded in processes of care, link together risk-taking, which is seen as fundamentally kind of rational, but also, dare I say it, placed within a kind of male category of virtues, and care and emotional labour. Actually, these are very much fused, and this is what became clear, is that demand for Tessa or for any of these SMEs to take on more risk, which is what is also being cascaded down the pyramid here, is risk. Magasin is taking on no risk. Magasin is not even taking on the risk of giving over shelf space to products that might not sell. They're just throwing them up online. The risk is being cascaded down, that demands enormous affective or emotional labour. And that also drains out that emotion. It exhausts that emotional capacity until actually you imperil not just the enterprise by leveraging it so much, but you imperil the entrepreneur. What would a win-win look like? Well, do you know what? For me, Stefano, the win-win comes back to that kind of policy directive, is that to create robust kind of local economies, which is ultimately the goal, to grow the economy locally, to create more employment, is to really focus on the local economy. And so to cut the global out altogether, to remove this promise and this myth of scaling up, and to actually go back to saying, well, these are very successful businesses, and that there is actually huge potential for them to grow and to employ more in the local market. But it's that's being completely imperiled, and not just imperiled, actually depleted through a fraudulent win-win. So there could be a win-win, and it could be through much better local, national, industrial policy that doesn't look to the global.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Dinah. I think we're going to wrap up your contribution right now. And thanks again. I hope that next time we have a meeting of our advisory board, we can meet in person. I'm also aware that people are spending a lot of time on Zoom and on Teams and all these other platforms. So I appreciate all of you who are online now, your extra effort. But in view also trying to minimize our extra time on it, I would like to suggest that we blend the discussion for the third session, where we discuss the edited book by Peter Lund Thompson, Michael Wetherbold Hansen, and Adam Lindgren, into also the discussion of future directions for research in business and development studies, since the book is essentially a collection that tells us where we are, or at least where we were when that book was put together. So the next round of discussions will be on the presentations by Peter and Michael, but also on the future directions for research in business and development. So the next presentation will be indeed about reflections on the book. And so Peter Lund Thompson is a professor with special responsibilities at CBDS, and his research focuses on sustainable value chains, industrial clusters, and corporate social responsibility, with a regional focus on South Asia. He has undertaken a number of in-depth studies of these themes in the football manufacturing, leather tanning, garment and textile industries in South Asia. Most recently, he has researched the formulation, implementation, and socioeconomic and environmental practices and impacts of the Better Cotton Initiative. He also has broad interest in the role of private sector in development and in the field of business and development studies. Michael Vedable Hansen is associate professor, also CBDS, Copenhagen Business School, and his main research interest is related to firm strategy, organization and management in emerging markets and developing countries. A key theme in his research is how conventional business theories and research methodologies need to be modified when we analyze firms in emerging markets and developing countries. Indeed, theoretically, he works with various international business theories and perspectives, including transaction cost economics, resource and capability perspectives, and spillover and linkage theories. He has done extensive empirical research on Danish multinational corporations in developing countries and emerging markets, on outward FDI from developing countries, particularly from India, and on private sector development. So the floor is yours. Peter, I understand, is going to go first, and then Michael, and then we'll have the discussion. Peter?
Yeah, hi, Stefano. I just want to know if you guys can hear me.
Yes, everything looks, the slide is up and we can hear you well.
Okay, great. So here we go. And thanks to Dina and also Andy for your presentations, and for everyone who is still here to hang in there for a couple of more minutes. We'll try to be brief so we can get on to the discussion section. What I'm going to do is here talk a little bit about a new edited volume that we had coming out in hardback at the end of last year, and then in e or sort of Kindle version at the early part of this year, where we try to broaden out the discussion to look at the subject of business and development studies, issues and perspectives in this Routledge edited volume. So the background for this was very briefly that for many years we'd had the Center for Business and Development Studies here at the Copenhagen Business School. We had also had an associated teaching program, a master's in business and development studies, but we hadn't really defined at the time, which was about 5 years back, what development and sort of business and development studies as an academic discipline was all about. So we took that as an opportunity to actually try to see if we could produce an edited volume on that. I should say that the people who were involved in the production of this edited volume was a fairly small group of researchers who were at the center at that time. Not everyone was involved at the time, about 5 years ago when we conceived this project, and the center has still since expanded dramatically. We're now about 25 full-time researchers at the center, which is now headed by Stefano since 1st Jan 2019. So if we think about the difference between then and now, I think in terms of our center, then we're probably looking a bit more into the economic issues related to business and sustainable development. We had some focus on sustainable value chains at the time, also looking into other aspects like workers, industrial relations and stuff. But given the fact that we are 25 full-time researchers now in the center, last year, my colleague Lisa and Richie did this word cloud where we'd basically all written down what were the main themes we were researching on, all 25 of us. And we came up with this word cloud, which puts somehow business in the middle, business in the context of developing countries, and then linking up to all sorts of diverse topics. So I think that again puts that question, is it at all possible to speak of some kind of unified field of business and development studies, or is that simply a too broad a concept to conceptualize as a research field? Just by way of background, I also mentioned that we have this master's program in business and development studies. So we took that as a starting point, in a sense, for trying to think through, what might actually constitute a research field known as business and development studies. At the moment, it looks more or less like this. So we are having about 80 students full-time every year that take this program, 2 years, 4 semesters. And in the first semester, they have 4 compulsory courses, 1 on business strategy, 1 on international business and economic development, 1 on the role of governance and development, and then responsible value chains. In the spring semester, they have a core course on entrepreneurship for development and managing foreign direct investment projects in developing countries. They then take a number of elective regional courses, and some of these regional courses also comes with a language component, either French, German, or Spanish. And there's also a possibility for having a Chinese or a Japanese sort of line, which is though taught in English for that particular elective course. In their third semester, our students then do sort of internships in various regions of the world, working in organizations and businesses that are somehow can be broadly described as fitting within the field of business and development studies. And then in their fourth semester, they then take sort of a master's, they write their master's thesis on the broad subject of a sort of a subtopic within the field of business and development studies. But starting with that, we had a kind of a teaching agenda on business and development studies, but we didn't really have a research agenda 5 years back. So what we did was we had some internal workshops where we also sometimes invited a couple of external stakeholders. And we then asked ourselves, what would we then define as the key sort of defining characteristics of the business and development studies research, if we can think about that as an academic discipline. So what we felt was that actually business, the core question that business and development studies research would seek to answer based upon our internal brainstorming sessions, was that we have to think about whether business is really a source of progress or a source of harm, that is a source of economic, social, and environmental progress, or as a source of economic, social, and environmental harm in the global south. That was the key question that we saw that business and development studies sought to investigate. So within that, there were certain characteristics or common denominators in this research field that we identified. First one was one around the politics of scarcity, that different actors, including businesses, workers, government, communities, and other actors, compete over scarce resources. These could be scarce economic resources, for example, unequal distributions of economic value in value chains, or it could be, for example, in the environmental field or in the natural resources extraction sectors, where businesses sometimes, create environmental pollution or take over the land of communities. So this idea about the politics of scarcity involving corporations and other stakeholders in the global south, we saw as the first key characteristics of business and development studies as a research, as an academic discipline. The second one was that actually, which something that has also come through quite strongly in Andy's and Dina's presentations earlier today, was that we have to think about businesses not in sort of a broad sense in the global south, rather businesses as working within local institutional environments. And by institutional environment, I mean sort of the formal rules and informal rules of the game, including state-level regulation, the enforcement agencies of the state, and also the informal norms and values that guide entrepreneurial and business activities and the activities of other actors such as states and communities in the global south. So clearly doing business in India is not the same as doing business in Kenya, and that is again not the same as doing business in Brazil. So taking into account the role of local institutional environments, we saw as a second key defining denominator of business and development studies. The third one was something that I alluded to in a comment to one of the earlier presentations, was that it's necessary to think about the role of business in the global south in a historical perspective. So if we just take, for example, the case of India, for actually several hundred years, India was ruled by the British East India Company. Their rule only ended in India in 1849, and clearly even going up to today, if you speak to entrepreneurs in India, you would often hear them talking about the historical role of sort of the colonizers, the East India Company. So would have comments like, don't try to be like the East Indian Company. So even today, the historical experiences with Western multinational companies in the global south, in particular countries, has been something that, in a sense, still play an important role. Another characteristic has been this idea with business and development studies researchers trying to identify policy-oriented problems of the kinds that Dina was talking about before, and then finding concrete solutions, or at least providing or advocating some types of solutions to these problems. The idea has also been, I think, that business and development studies research has had a fairly normative approach in its way of going about investigations in this field. So the idea is you want to create a better world, and you want to, as a researcher, somehow work towards that your studies, your research should help create the knowledge foundation, which would allow policymakers to make better and more well-informed policy decisions. And the final characteristic of business and development studies research we saw as being this focus on extended in-depth fieldwork and researchers spending long time in individual countries and contexts in the Global South. So we then had an international call for papers, and we received quite a few papers. Some of them we accepted for this edited volume. And in trawling through all the papers, we thought that we could identify 4 cross-cutting themes that in a sense help define what business and development studies also was. First one was business governance and development. Second one, global value chains, business and development. The third one, international business, CSR development. And the fourth, local firms, organizations and development. And just to give you a quick overview of some of the chapters we had here. So we had chapters that dealt an overview chapter that's basically presenting what I'm talking about now. Then we had contributions on both from within the CBDS, from IDS in the UK, and from co-authors in London and Finland that dealt with relations around state-business relations, the role of international business and economic development, and the role of international donors in financing and making sort of private sector aid more socially responsible in the Global South. So this is really more looking at the role of sort of the interaction between state or state agencies and business in the context of the Global South. So the second theme we saw as important in business and development studies was the role of global value chains, business and development. And here we have an introductory chapter by Gary Gireffi, who outlines the GVC approach. We then go on to talk, myself and Adam Lindgren, who is the third co-editor of this edited volume. He's the head of marketing department at CBS, where we talk about how we can conceptualize CSR and global value chains. We then had a more sort of critical chapter by Valerie Nelson and her colleague Michael Flint, both in the UK, that looked at some of the limitations of sort of working with sustainable global value chains. And finally, we had a chapter by our colleague Aman Hassan from Aarhus University in Denmark, who looked at multi-stakeholder initiatives in global value chains and their implications for women workers also in the Global South. The third theme that runs across the chapters in the book and also in our identification of business and development studies as a research field is the role that multinational companies really played in relation to CSR and development in the Global South. And we have several chapters, both by our own CBS colleagues, by Anne Kalk and her colleagues from the University of Amsterdam Business School, by Dima Jamali and some of her colleagues at the University of Beirut, that all try to conceptualize the role of and provide an update on the discussion of CSR in the role of business in developing countries. We then had a sort of more contextual chapter that dealt with that by Anabela Davila from Mexico, and a more sort of critical perspective on CSR and the abuse of human rights by Joanna Bauer from Columbia University and the CEO of the World Fair Trade Organization, whose name I think is pronounced Irinch Sahan. And finally, another critical contribution that looked sort of at the downside of neoliberal wind energy investments on environmental justice and human rights in Mexico. The fourth perspective, or the fourth, we can say, stream of research that we identified within business and development studies was really about the role of local firms, organizations, and development. And one chapter here looking at the role of Ugandan micro and small businesses as the determinants of innovative performance. In these sort of smaller local organizations, we also included the idea of microfinance programs and its relationship to women's empowerment. A third theme that we saw as fitting under this categorization was social entrepreneurship. And finally, we saw that at the micro level, you can also study micro, small business clusters and local development policies. So we had this focus on smaller local organizations under this heading, whether it be social entrepreneurship, SME clusters, or microfinance programs. Just to summarize, what we saw as 4 cross-cutting themes in business and development studies included business and the role of sort of the interaction between business and the state in the form of state donor and intergovernmental organizations, and the extent to which this kind of business-state interaction played a helpful or harmful role in relation to development. We looked also at, we identified the second stream as relating to the transnational organization orchestration of industries, particularly through value chains and its implications for sustainable trade and the social upgrading and downgrading of developing country firms, farmers, and workers. And the third theme we saw in business and development studies we identified as related to international business CSR development, where we had the role of sort of the focus on how MNCs might have certain perceptions or ways of interacting, creating responsible stakeholder management, a theme that also came through in Dina's presentation, I felt. And looking at the role of FDI in developing countries as well. I mean, how do this involvement of MNCs impact upon climate change, human rights, labor conditions, gender conditions, and environmental justice? And how do these MNCs also impact upon communities? So the final one, again, was this more local micro-level perspective in business and development studies that looked at the role of local firms, organizations, and their sort of positive and negative contribution to economic, social, and environmental aspects of development. So what about future research agendas? Well, that's the topic for the rest of today's seminar. I would just like to mention one thing, which is that I think that in this field we have not been very good to start discussing our research methods, the research challenges, in particular questions around research ethics. So I'm wondering whether there's a need to produce a special issue on sort of the methodology and sort of ethics of business and development studies. At least I heard a lot of dilemmas coming through in both Andy's and Dina's presentation. So that's it for me, and then on to Michael.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you, Michael.
Good.
Thank you. Coming through.
Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay. So I think I'll start where Peter stopped because in a way it's very difficult to talk about business and development studies in general. Each of us come with a particular disciplinary approach. We come from a particular tradition. We have a particular career paths and so on. So the approach I'll take in this presentation is really to try to look at how do you try to integrate business and development perspectives within the international business field. And international business is in itself a vast literature that has existed for more than 50 years. And the idea is basically to try to see how has international business studies tackled the question of development over the years. And I hope that the insights from and experiences from international business studies can give us some help in understanding what is really the challenges of integrating business and development studies in general. So what I'll do is that I'll try to analyze how IB, international business, engage with development issues over time, and then ask the question, how did international business over time engage with these issues? And the claim of the paper is that IB lost sight of grand development questions that inspired the early literature, instead immersing itself in an increasingly specific theory and method-driven agenda. And yeah, you can read more about that in the paper that I submitted for the book. But let me very quickly run through the argument. So IB is basically the literature dealing with the multinational corporation, that is companies that are operating and organizing activities across borders. And interesting, the IB literature was very much born out of an interest in the role that multinationals they play in development. Some of the early authors, they argued that multinationals, they were kind of engines of development, trailblazers of modernity, that they were introduction of efficiencies. Others, they were very critical about multinational activity, looking into issues related to restricted business practice and so on. However, by the early 2000s, many started arguing that the IP literature had lost sight of the grand societal and developmental questions, and that IP was running out of steam, that there was not this problem empirical driven agenda that had characterized the early literature. And I've tried to take a more systematic approach to this issue in the paper by asking whether is it really true that international business lost sight of multinationals' development role. And I do that by conducting qualitative content analysis of the top IB journals' treatment of development issues, and also a more quantitative survey of development markers in IB journals. And I'll go very quickly through this. So basically, there are two perspectives in IB that talks about development. One is kind of a classical business perspective on developing countries. So you look into marketing activities of multinationals and how the particular institutional context challenges multinationals, or how you source activities there. So it's a traditional business approach, but adapted to developing countries. Another part of the IB literature looks into what we normally would call truly development types of issues, that they look into the impacts of multinationals on development. What are the kinds of spillovers and linkages to local companies, firms, economies? To what extent do MNCs contribute to integrating into global value chains or not? How do multinationals manage externalities through CSR? And so on. So there's clearly this division of labor in the IB literature. I tried to then get an impression of these markers of development orientation in the literature to find out whether there is actually any detectable evolution in how IB works with development issues. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of articles in the three top IB journals that actually talks about developing countries, emerging markets, and things like that. So it's not unimportant. It's not that development impact or issues are sidelined in the IB literature. However, when we look at the kind of markers for specific focus on development impact, then we'll see that there are fewer articles that refer to, for instance, spillovers, CSR, sustainable development, base of the pyramid approaches. And if we look at the development over time, we can see that where developing countries, as I said before, had a high level of interest in the early IB literature, then flattening out during the 1980s and then increasing up until around 2010. We can also see that the kind of development problem markers, such as spillovers, sustainable development, and so on, account for around 10-15% of articles in the three top journals. So my finding here is that there's a lot of IB research and increasing IB research that focuses on developing countries, but it's mainly related to the business perspective, MNC strategy, organization, and management, and less frequently the literature touches upon the role and impact of multinationals in development processes. It's also clear that IB has not developed an own approach to development impact. So basically what you find on development impacts is offsprings from other disciplines like development economics, value chain literature, and CSR. And a last observation is that IB has moved in the direction of increasingly advanced quantitative analysis based on increasingly specific, some would say esoteric, theory-driven models. So what is the problem in relation to our discussion here? It seems that IB has lost this engagement with grand development challenges that had characterized the early literature. And that much of what is going on and the limited literature that exists on development impacts is basically not very innovative. It rests on what I call passive import of methods and theories from adjacent disciplines. And there's clearly a lack of focus on IB's comparative advantage in this development research taking place, that is understanding multinationals being multinationals. And as a consequence, it seems that IB has lost relevance to current development practice. What is then the learnings from our general discussion of business and development studies? I think this counts for all disciplines that we are working within and literatures that we are engaging with, that there are huge challenges of overcoming disciplinary logics and path dependencies when trying to understand business and development interfaces. And very easily we are pushed into kind of disciplinary echo chambers and silos. And it seems that these internal logics in disciplines easily overrides the empirical problem orientation. So I don't know whether this is a problem in other literatures and fields, but at least I could suspect that we all are facing similar problems of integrating development perspectives into our respective fields. So to conclude, there's no doubt that a lot is taking place in terms of interfaces between business and development. I've just mentioned some of the themes here: business and power to entrepreneurship, climate change, CSR, industrialization, trade and development, SDGs, and so on. That the empirical field is moving, and practitioners are moving, and academia is trying to keep up, but faces challenges in terms of disciplinary logics that are moving us in other directions. Maybe, at least in the case of IB, seemingly causing the literature to lack relevance to development practice. So in conclusion, if you can generalize anything from this, then it's to engage with and try to engage with these interfaces of business and development studies. It's extremely important that you have proper orientation, empirical drivedness, and engagement with practice and loosening disciplinary boundaries. So that was very quickly the gist of the article on business and development studies from an international business perspective.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask you to unshare your desktop so we can pull up the we can see. Perfect. Thank you very much. So we have about 15 minutes left in our session for today, and we have two questions that have come in the chat in the meanwhile, and I'm encouraging others to write their own questions or comments as we go along with these two. I'll start with a question by Faith Atani, who's a colleague at CBS, and it's particularly for Peter, and he says the following: just wondering if technological change or ecosystem of new technology and its impact on least developed countries in GBCs is covered by any of the themes, maybe a part of upgrading, or is it not CBDS's main interest? That's one question. The second one is from me. I wrote that earlier on when you were talking, Peter. And it's a question for both of you. And Michael has approached, part of his presentation touches on this, but I want him to go back to it from a perspective of what I'm writing here. So in business and development studies, we are we doing business studies, including IB, but with contextual embedding in developing countries? Or are we doing development studies and then focus on business? And are we combining the two? And if so, to what extent? Is there anything specific that distinguishes us? So these are the two questions. I'll let you two decide who wants to go first. And maybe the first question was with Peter. I'll let Peter go first then.
Yes, hi Faith, thanks for the question. Basically, we had to do a more or less, I suppose, artificial sort of distinction based upon these 4 different themes in business and development studies. Clearly, the cake could have been cut in a different way, and I'm hoping that others would make their own tries at defining what are the sort of the sub fields within business and development studies. So yeah, it could be part of upgrading, definitely, but maybe this is not a perfect categorization. And I hope we will move forward with more contributions in this field. But what I think is coming to Stefano's question, I think what's really the core question, what's at stake here in this book is, how do we as business schools in particular engage with the role of business in developing countries? Is that going to be, and it also speaks to Andy's presentation, I think earlier on, and to many other people who've been working in this field, is it the role of business schools basically just to teach marketing, strategy, etc., operations in the context of developing countries or the global south? Or must there be an explicit connection to the developmental outcomes, the economic, social, environmental outcomes of business activities in developing countries? I would definitely argue that it should and must be the latter. Otherwise, I don't really see any role for business and development studies as an academic research field.
Thank you, Peter. Michael?
Yeah, I slightly disagree with Peter, but that's also clear in our discussions about the book. But because I think it's both. I mean, I don't think you can separate it. I think in order for development practice to be successful and also development studies to be more empirically, aligned, then you need a firm and good understanding of business and how business works. From a policy perspective, basing development policy perspective, basing a development intervention on a faulty understanding of how multinationals, for instance, strategize and are organized, and the incentives that they are facing, that just leads to failed intervention. So I think it goes both ways, and also seen from a business perspective, it's absolutely essential to have a good understanding of development issues in the modern world, because it can jeopardize your entire operation if you operate without a firm understanding of how you impact on development. So I think it goes both ways.
Thank you very much. Peter, you want to reply to that?
Yeah, I think that just shows that it's possible to be co-editing books where you're not necessarily in agreement about everything. So then you have to sort of work through it and come to some kind of a joint understanding, which I think we did here. But I think another question that's posed by the book is also whether we should, for example, study business and development studies as sub-disciplines. For example, we look at modern slavery, and then we don't see any connections between that and then a question of, for example, regarding women's entrepreneurship in a different context. So what we postulate is essentially that it makes sense to think about these different subtopics in a broader context of the role of businesses in development. I'm not really sure whether it's like we've come up with sort of the emperor's new clothes type of thing. Does business and development studies at all exist as an academic discipline? I'm not sure. Even after all of this work, we still make that claim. But I think it's important to look at this thing about drawing connections between different types of discussions, different types of fields, so we don't, in a sense, miss the elephant, by holding on to the trunk or to the tail and sort of miss the broader perspective.
Thank you very much, Peter and Michael. I think we've been online over 2 hours, which we know is very tiring. I have the last question that just came in from Søren, our colleague at CBDS, and his comment is to my question. So it answers my question. We should aim to work towards a combination of the two, and here we have work to do. Smiley. More, just a second, just covered by something else. Just give me a second, just a second. More specifically, I think we need to have more focus on local firms as we know little about them. Then we have a comment by Andrew Crane. Is the center about business and development studies or business and development? studies, which is another way of framing my earlier question. I think that's an interesting one. We're getting more questions, so I'm gonna bring them in. And Luis Bernardo, going back to historical perspectives, what could be the role for history and transnational governance here? I'm thinking about the origins of transnational corporations as things to govern and or to regulate. So I'm going to bring out these three last-minute questions to Peter and Michael, and then we'll probably wrap up. Would you like to go first, Peter?
Yes, I'd like to say that I agree with what Søren has written here, not surprisingly. But I think another thing in response to Andrew's question is the center about business and development studies are separate things, or is it a combination, trying to do a joint sort of project? My sense is this is probably going to be a contested issue as this field evolves and as we evolve our activities within the center. Clearly, I think what we are aiming for is a joint business and development studies field and center. But I think the powerful thing about this kind of agenda, if we can call it this, is that it's both internally contested within our center, and I think it's also globally contested. If we look at all the people who are generally working in this field, they have different takes, they have different starting points, different disciplinary backgrounds coming into that, and different value sets. And I think that's why we have something we can actually work on, and why it makes sense to push this agenda forward. Exactly because we don't agree all the time, everywhere, in all places. That's what makes it dynamic. And then Luis Bernardo had a question, perhaps about the historical perspective. Perhaps you want to answer that, Michael?
Yeah, I can also answer that, but can I just relate to Andrew's comment, because I think that's a very good comment. It's a little bit whether it's business studies and development studies, or it's business and development studies. That's what we're talking about here. And at least I think an advantage we have coming from where we coming from a business school background is that we have to have a business studies approach. This is what we are training our students for, and we are a business school who is kind of the partner to also the Danish business community. So it is about business studies is in the equation. It's not business and development studies, but it's business studies and development studies. Clearly, in my view, at least that's where we have, I think, our comparative advantage in relation to others that are working with similar issues. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, one of the things that I really like about our center is that we have a wide variety of entry points into the field of business and development, wherever the quotes you want to put them. We have different methodologies, and so that we have some work to do ahead of us. The book itself was edited at a time when there was a particular group of people. Now the group is bigger and also goes in different directions. And diversity can be a good factor. It can also create a lot of different, a variety of directions that may or may not come together. So we do have a good bit of thinking that we need to do as a group. Lisa just sent a joiner to Andrew's quotation and definition suggestion, and her goes like this: the business of development and the development of business, which is also another way of looking at some of the work we do. Good. So I get the sense that...
Sorry, we had one more question, Bernardo, we haven't answered.
Yes, do you want to go back to the history question of transnational corporations, or should we leave it for maybe a bilateral answer if you want to do it later?
No, just to say very briefly that it is definitely part of the broader agenda, and that's something that I think we need to look into.
And I think this is precisely where this interdisciplinary approach proves its worth, because this is both an issue that draws on political economy and political science, but also an issue that draws on corporate governance, MNC organization, and so on. So I think that's spot on in terms of the kind of things that we want to do.
And thank you, Luis, for the question. Also, let's remember we have a Center for Business History in a different department. So we do have historians in CBS who work on these things, so that we can also reach out to them. In conclusion, I would like to thank very specifically our presenters, Andy, Dinah, Peter, and Michael. I would like also to thank Sarah Netter, our manager at CBDS, for organizing the event. And for once, actually, we had no major glitches, and it seems like it has run relatively unscathed. I'm quite happy about that, because it's always, you never know how these things go. So thank you to Sarah and Dominique, our student assistant, who's also been on call. And last but not least, all the participants to today's webinar/workshop. At some point, we had 68 people online, which was it's really good for us to have this broad participation. I understand that the format is not optimal for that kind of back and forth debates that we like to have. But at the very least, we were able to bring in some of the more contentious issues on the floor. And with that, I would like to invite everyone to clap to themselves and to say thank you for coming and for your participation. Thank you so much. This is always very awkward online, but I keep trying to see whether maybe in time we're going to develop something a little bit less awkward. And thanks a lot, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.